This is Karen with newclevelandradio.net, and it is time for the Intentionality Gurus with Candace Pollock. And today, the subject matter is take a deep breath because here it goes grief recovery lessons about myths and energy relieving behaviors. Wow. Like, what in the heck are we talking about today?
Well, another cheerful little conversation about grief. So it's just a continuation of some of the lessons we learned last time.
Okay.
And if I'll just review those briefly the last time. So
Sure.
we learned that grief is natural, unavoidable, and uh, basically something that everybody grieves in their own way. So we all grieve 100% in our own way. We can't compare our grief to someone else, nor should we allow others to compare their grief with ours. And it involves the conflicting feelings when there's been a change in a familiar pattern or behavior. So that definition isn't tied to death necessarily, although that certainly would be an obvious change, but it could be all of the other scenarios we addressed the last time. So it could be a job change, which is a good thing, but also has some changes in terms of relocation and maybe saying goodbye to friends and coworkers. Well, and we discussed that last time, that you moved to a different location with the one job that you have. And we learned that there are things that people tell us when we're grieving, when somebody passes primarily, but it could be something else if somebody were to lose a job or have a health setback and so on. So, and we have cultural things that inform how we think about grief and how we should behave during grief. And we discussed last time some of the things that people have said to you or said to me, and what I've heard say to other people. So today we're going to talk specifically about 6 myths. So all of this material that we're talking about comes from the grief recovery method, which is a term of art. It's a trademark term. It represents a program created originally by John James, a man who started grieving when his child died in infancy, and he struggled to regain his equilibrium, his equanimity, and found that the materials that were available to him, this is in the 70s, were pretty thin. And so in his search over time, he put together a program that for himself that worked, and others noticed it, and then he made it into a program. So it's been around more than 20 years. Well, that you do the math. The late 70s, but the
Right.
the book came out, the second edition came out after 20 years. So the long and short of it is there is a standardized way that we can approach grief that has scientifically been proven, it's been peer reviewed to produce beneficial outcomes for grievers.
Okay.
And while we're talking about it in these podcasts, it's not the program itself. So what we're talking about is just to sensitize people to their own grief, where it may show up, and where it may show up for other people. Alrighty, so today we're going to talk about some of the myths. So they sound a little bit like some of the things we talked about the last time, the things that people say them, but this is how they become myths. And so we can identify. So one of them is don't feel bad. So it's a myth that, like as if that would work, right? And I think I mentioned the last time, it's like saying to a little child afraid of the dark, don't be afraid of the dark. Like that works. But the other ways that it can show up is, the underlying phrase might be, it could have been worse. You could have lost both legs rather than just one leg, or you could have been killed rather than just, shaken, or you could be, you might be able to have another child or something if you lost a child.
Sure.
All right, it could be worse. The other is replace the loss. There's the child or the pet being suggested as a replacement. Anything resonate for you so far, just on those two?
Well, it's interesting because we're recording this on Sunday, May the 9th. It happens to be Mother's Day. And I read something that somebody posted today that this is the worst day of the year for them. And this is a young woman who has been unable to become a mother.
Hmm.
And my heart goes out to her because um, it's when you want something so badly and you just can't get it, that's a form of grief. And you can sort of, deal with it, 364 days a year, but come Mother's Day, and if you wanted to be a mother, um, it hurts that uh, you too aren't celebrating with others. Um, but I wrote something yesterday, and I'm hoping that if she listens to this and other people listen to this, is that I know nothing replaces your own child or your adoptive child or your fur baby or whatever, but um, we need to be more sensitive to each other and um, understand that there's a way that we can share um, our lives with other people so that today doesn't have to be the worst day of the year for her.
Right. And, I have clients who have been estranged from children. Their children have absented themselves from the relationship. Sometimes these are parents of only one child. And so that they don't have the solace of other family members, even though that would be considered a myth that the solace from the others would entirely replace the loss of the child who has estranged themselves from the relationship. And certainly people who have had miscarriages and so on. So just to all the little nuances in terms of how something we say with the best of intentions as a way to appeal to the um, to soften it. I can't even come up with the right words, but those phrases are true in the brain, but they don't address what the heart is experiencing. And that's the one of the points in the grief recovery method, that we're dealing with the unmet communications, undelivered communications that occurred at the time of the loss that we don't have a chance to communicate. And all of these phrases that deal with the brain are like, we're going to fall off like Teflon. They would fall off of Teflon.
Exactly. I remember when my oldest son was born, the doctor delivered him very quickly because the doctor was going on vacation. So people are listening to this might be able to relate that because he was in such a hurry, he decided to perform a forceps birth, which made the soft spot on my son's head enlarged, which automatically they thought that he was ill and had encephalitis. And so he was taken away from me. Um, I'll never forget the call that I got from my mother that said, God doesn't give you more than what you can deal with. And at that time, it was like, I can't deal with this. Um, and so there are terms that we use culturally that, now that I think back on them, they're almost hurtful. They make the grieving even worse.
Well, it can trigger a sense of isolation because, clearly I had my mother say the same thing to me. I was going through a divorce. I was in my first year of law school. I was running a business supporting myself. And I said, but I think he has the wrong house, because I'm at my wit's end, but it didn't offer me, the, and I'm not criticizing my mother, but
Sure.
it was okay. This is not helpful. I can't go here for what I need, or what I need isn't here, I guess is a better way to say it. And that leads to one of the other myths, that you have to grieve alone, that you're on your own. And I had a situation where my husband passed, and I saw a colleague at an event one month, the month of about 4 months after he passed. And then I saw him, and I mentioned that my husband died, and I hadn't seen him in a long time. And I said, "Oh, my husband died." And at that point, I was still quite tearful. I was like a little wet sponge most of the time. And then about a year later, when the event occurred again, I saw him again. And my husband's death was still as present to me as it had been when I saw him the prior year. And so when he said, "How are you doing?" I wasn't thinking about the last time. I didn't even remember the last time. And I said, "Oh, so-and-so, my husband died." And I wasn't as teary. I mean, my eyes did tear up just a bit. He goes, "Oh, you told me that last time." Oh, excuse me.
Yeah.
I'm sorry that it's
Remember?
still as painful as if it had just occurred.
Right. Exactly.
So my bad that I didn't remember who I had told, and that I still have, weepy feelings and so on. So that was for me, grieve alone, and you have to be careful what you say. Another one is be strong. So you ever hear anybody say that? Like
Oh,
you got to stiff upper lip?
absolutely. When I was going through my divorce, um, that was what everybody said to me. "Oh, you are so strong. You can get through anything." And it was, um, but what if I don't want to be strong right now? What if I just want to sit down and cry my eyes out? Um, and it was like I wasn't being given permission to do that because so many people, told me that I was strong. I could handle it.
Right. And I was talking to somebody recently, and they said that when they went through a death in the family, somebody said the women in our family are strong. So, just based on gender, you have to be strong, or be strong for the children. Don't let the children see you cry, those kinds of things, because you'll upset them. Keep busy. That's a big one. That's a myth. Keeping busy, as if that will distract you from the loss, the grief. And, that has always been my go-to activity in order to deal with any uncomfortable feelings, but it doesn't work. You just drag around your baggage and so on. And then time heals all wounds, as if. And so recently I was talking in a group of grief recovery specialists, people who have been trained in this method. And one woman had lost a child to SIDS,
Mm.
and she had two other children. And the time heals all word, she had formal training in psychology and so on, but she said, she understood from a psychological standpoint how those things work. But that phrase was just, she understood in her brain, but again, not in her heart. And I know that we all probably have said these things, but maybe now we can be a little sensitive to it, but also understand how it may play a role in our own life, because, we can be saying these things to ourselves.
Absolutely.
So, getting into the topic of stress relieving, short-term energy relieving behaviors. That's what it stands for. So we talked briefly using the acronym last time, STIRBS. So what John James discovered in his research in his own experience of grief, but then dealing with so many people afterwards when they kept coming to him to help them with their grief, based on what he had applied in his own life, he identified that we generally will resort to short-term energy relieving behaviors. And that's not just confined to grief. I started noticing them everywhere, which is one of the reasons I wanted to raise this topic and this method, because it's not just applicable to grief. One, grief is much broader than we give it credit for, as we've discussed. Two, there are lessons here that go beyond the boundaries of just grief. So for me, after my husband died, I would go to work, I would come home, I would feed the creatures, I would get 2 Klondikes, I would go upstairs, get ready for bed, and binge watch Law and Order, and eat the Klondikes. And I did that easily, I'm going to say 6 to 8 weeks. That was it. And then, I'd brush my teeth, but I would get up and repeat the next day. So my short-term energy relieving behaviors were to eat that ooky sweet stuff and, zone out on the television.
Sure.
What about you?
Um, so I don't do anything short term that I'm aware of. I usually just jump right back in and try to um, I'm not going to say bury it, but um, I'm like a bulldozer. I want to get it over with if there's such a thing.
Put
So,
distance between you and it,
pardon?
whatever loss. Put distance between, in terms of activity between you and whatever the loss was.
Right. So, like when my mother passed away, obviously the most recent one that I can discuss was that um, after we packed up her house and I came back home after 2.5 months, it was like, okay, these are the things I have to keep doing. Um, I'm not going to forget her. And I know it hurts, but um, I have to take care of my son. I have to take care of my husband. I have to take care of me. I have a job to do. And so I just bulldoze ahead, but I allow myself bits and pieces of time to um, zone out and feel. And then it's like, okay, no more. You got to keep going.
Yeah, and I was that way. I mean, I didn't lose a day from work. I just kept going, and I put in my normal hours. And, I did go home. Every once in a while I would shop, grocery shop, and so on. But, we all have our own version of our short-term behaviors. If somebody has a tendency towards addictions, it could be food addictions, it could be alcohol, drugs, sex, other activity, even so-called healthy addictions like running or, um, working out at the gym and so on. And for younger grievers, children, there might be bullying, there might be cutting, there could be, isolating themselves, not wanting to talk, not engaging, cutting themselves off from friends and so on. For some people, shopping, not grocery shopping, but the regular, shop until you drop kind
Right.
of concept. And food, obviously. So some of the it's tied to one of the myths, more or less, that don't deal with it, but have a cookie.
Yeah.
The kinds of things we're taught to relieve those kinds of uncomfortable feelings and so on. So how do you see that where Sturbs may have played a role in others' lives, if at all?
Um, you know, thinking back on different instances, my husband had a very, very good job when Alex was born. And his manager at the time, uh, I don't know if she just didn't like him or just didn't want him to work for her, whatever. She conjured up some things about him that weren't true and pushed him into the corner. And it was like either quit or be fired. And um, he took being fired as being the worst thing. Although looking back, he should have been fired because he could have collected unemployment, but instead, he quit. Um, and he has grieved over this for almost 30 years now. Um, and he's grieved over it because he knows he didn't do anything wrong. He wanted to stay working for this company for a lifetime. Um, and everything that he's done since then, he he measures to this. And he's always looking over his shoulder, that something bad is going to happen. And he just hasn't gotten over that that separation feeling.
When you say he's looking over his shoulder and he measures everything in relation to it. So it's either better than or less than that.
Right. But he's always fearful, you know, if I continue to be good at this because I was good at that other job, okay, then what's going to happen to me? Am I going to keep going forward, or am I going to be separated or drop back in some way?
So even when you do a good job, you can't feel secure.
Right, exactly.
Be pulled out from underneath you.
Right. And it's a grief that you know, he's been to therapy for it. He and I have talked about it till, sometimes I want to pull my hair out of my head. Um, but I understand where he's coming from because it was something that really meant so much to him. Um, and he feels like, it was just taken away. And, um, you know, there's there's nothing that he can find to do to um, not feel the way he does.
Well, I have a suggestion, but
Okay.
I don't know if he listens.
Well, I can share it with him.
So the idea is that there were conflicting feelings. So a loss occurred. He had conflicting feelings, and it's not fair to do this without his permission, but I can take that license. Can I?
Yes,
Okay.
you may.
That I imagine the conflicting feelings were, an abrupt sense of loss, a sense of unfairness, having the rug pulled out underneath him, anger, so a bit of a mix. The him versus them, and so on. Maybe finding other opportunities, but always grieving the fact that it wasn't as good as it might have been.
Right.
Okay. And so on. And had he been able to communicate at the time something that he wanted more or less of, or otherwise communicate, that's where the suffering comes in, that we are not allowed to complete our grief and be able to communicate something that was not communicated at the time of the loss.
Okay.
All right. And then this energy, relieving behaviors, whether they're short term or long term, is, comparing all of those things, spending, time on it, et cetera, but just to be able to be aware of it. Normally when there's short-term energy relieving behaviors, we do them because they work. I mean, they temporarily relieve us from our angst, our loss, our sadness, the conflicting feelings, the confusion. But when they proceed, then what the grief recovery method offers is a way, in a very intentional, structured, but not rigid way, to deal with that incomplete set of communications and it would include his hopes and dreams about his future, not just what he wanted to say to individuals, but what he was, foreseeing for himself. And this would be parallel for all of us. So the method is universal. Everybody brings their own version of their loss. And sometimes, as we've discussed before, we all probably have an onion of these things where it's one layer after another layer after another layer. And sometimes we're bringing stuff from way back that is coloring how we handle what's going on in our current lives. So anyway, I would just suggest that maybe he just even read the book, the Grief Recovery Method Handbook, which is readily available.
And that is something that he
That's the entire program there.
Yeah.
Pardon me.
Very
So,
good.
so anyway, in terms of short-term relieving behaviors, and in the program, what we do is we have people, make a list of the myths that they have learned or they feel that they've adopted or they have observed in others, and then make a list of the short-term energy relieving behaviors they may have engaged in. So anybody listening could do that and just pay attention as things percolate in your brain, so you can see how that might play into things. So what I'd like to do the next time is go into more of the specifics. This is just all kind of background to kind of inform what some of the lessons are. It's not going to be the same as the program, as I said, but it would be some indication to give people some comfort in terms of what it might be about if they were ever to do the program, or at a minimum pique their interest about looking at grief more closely and maybe looking at the handbook more closely, or maybe even doing the program.
That sounds interesting. Um, just so that our listeners know, the other day we did a program, um, and the podcaster had on a person who is a yoga instructor, does a number of different things, but she also does what she calls creative grief.
Mm-hmm.
And something happened the other day that really had gotten me down. Actually, it was last weekend, and this show came on 2 days later. And um, I found myself uh, doodling and creating these pictures, one after another. And I didn't pay any attention to them until yesterday. And when I looked at them, I realized that each day that I was doing them, I started feeling better. And so I contacted her and I said, is this what you were talking about? She said, and it can be any type of creative thing. But I was getting feelings out that I didn't realize, and they became part of these doodlings. And so, um, you know, I want to encourage people to listen to this podcast and find ways that we can get through the hard times. Because especially this past year has been difficult on the majority of us. And if we hide those feelings, it's only going to be worse for us.
Well, and I can't remember if I mentioned it last time, if I had attended a program, but it was talking about grief is becoming an epidemic. And the researcher who presented the program is actually the person who spearheaded the peer review research into the grief recovery method. So that's her area of specialty. And what she told us is that in 2005, I forget what government entity keeps these statistics, but the idea is that a death, and we're just talking about deaths in this kinds of losses in terms of this statistic, death touched or impacted at least 5 other people on average. That was the average.
Wow.
And now, just in the last year, they've determined that it is 9 other people. So what that means is, and so when we look at the deaths from COVID, think about the numbers, and she cited the numbers. I'm really bad about remembering numbers, but we're talking about millions, and the projection will continue for the numbers to go on, not necessarily be as high on a daily basis and so on as the vaccines seem to be having some impact. But the point is that there's much more grief going on, and it isn't just for the immediate family. It can, have that ripple effect in terms of
Absolutely.
impacting other people. So we do need to be aware of how we've got a lot of grieving people walking around, and that's just death grief. It isn't talking about, the others, the financial insecurity, the possible food insecurity, children being kept at home instead of going to class and losing some of their social support. So it's a huge topic. So I don't think it's necessarily a morose topic. I mean, I know a lot of people think of it that way, but it's, as I said, unavoidable.
Ab-
So
Absolutely.
look at it. So
Well,
thank you for letting me share this.
absolutely. And we will be back again in about 2 weeks. And we remind you to go to the website, theintentionalitygurus.com. You can find all the information about today's program and all the other podcasts out there. And you can learn a little bit more about Candace and how to contact her. So I want to thank you again, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you. Happy Mother's Day. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye bye now.